coming up, I just want to say this first part is kind of an introduction from my perspective as a manager. For the Tonto National Forest, we have about 830,000 acres of desert and another 37,000 acres of riparian area associated with the desert. And it's all changing pretty quickly. So what we've been struggling with is trying to understand what the actual role of fire was and is, and perhaps will be in the desert. And there's a big connection there with introduced grasses, I'll call them for the moment. Are you looking at the 4 peaks at this point?
No, can you try sharing one more time? Go ahead and hit share screen.
I can't understand what you're saying.
Go ahead and try sharing one more time. Hit share screen.
Okay. Is that better?
Yep, if you just put it in presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, so this is the view of the 4 peaks. It's my favorite feature on the Tonto National Forest. This is what it looked like in early spring of 2019, and this is what it looked like a couple of years later. This was after the bushfire. So in trying to sort out exactly what is going on out here, it's not just that fire is there, it's that fire is different. And trying to understand exactly what would be the appropriate fire behavior and therefore the effects. Is it looking more like this? Is this typical? Should this be more typical? Some people say there shouldn't be fire out there at all. It's just that we don't really understand the historic role of fire. I think there was, and I'm going to show a little bit about why I think there was. This next series of slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but what you're looking at, some of you have seen this, I know, because I use this sequence a lot. It's showing the lightning strikes across the Tonto National Forest by the month for a 10-year period. So this is January, and there's very few. They're little tiny red dots. Get into February, we see a little bit more, some fairly specific patterns of wear, mostly in the high areas. March, April, May, and we're getting a little closer to where we get really early monsoon once in a blue moon. And here monsoon's starting to come in, and then of course, boom, we get July when monsoon has been, at least most of the time, has been a little more predictable. And then August and so on. So if you look at those lower areas down towards the Phoenix area in the southwest part of this map, you can see there's a little less lightning down in that area, but there is still plenty of lightning down in the desert. So there were certainly ignition sources historically. On the Tonto National Forest, this is what it translates to in terms of fire overall. The map on the right with the blue dots is showing you where we had lightning-caused fires over the last 50 years. That's 55% of our fires. And then on the left are the human-caused fires, which pretty well outline where the roads and recreation areas are. But overall, looking at where we have fire in the desert is what I was interested in. So this is just showing you the complexity of the Tonto, and what I'd like you to focus on for a second here is the purple or the lavender stuff. That is Sonoran Desert. The orange is a chaparral, so infrequent high severity. Where it interfaces with the desert is a bit of a question mark. And then the yellow is a frequent fire system, semi-desert grasslands. Again, that interfaces directly with the desert in a lot of places. So if I simplify this to make it look just like fire regimes, we keep the desert in purple, riparian is blue, infrequent fire regimes, which also tend to have high severity fire when they have it, are orange, and then frequent fire, which can be high or low severity, is yellow. So there's a lot of interface with a lot of fire regimes for the Sonoran Desert. So it's starting, this is just like evidence number one that fire probably did occur in the desert, but we don't understand what its role was. Historically, these are the lightning fires across that area. This is across the whole Tonto, and you can see there's a lot more of them at the higher elevations, but there certainly were plenty in the desert. And in terms of the impacts that humans are having, this is where the human fires start, and there's an awful lot of them that start in the desert. And one of the reasons we've been getting a lot more in the desert is not just the ignitions, but if you go back to the fire triangle, you need to have fuel as well as ignition, as well as oxygen. So this is showing we have plenty of ignitions, and with the change in the fuel structure, we have plenty of fuel much of the time too now. So this is just the riparian, and you can see it's pretty scattered. We all know that riparian areas in dry systems such as the Sonoran Desert are much more valuable and critical to those systems than they may be where it's a little easier to find water. So we throw the desert on top of that, and this is what it looks like. Then here's the lightning strikes. So these are the lightning fires. This is the lightning density in the Sonoran Desert. There is some variability based on topography, not just where it's high, but for example, over in the Sonoran, in Tunnel Basin, which is, I think you can see my cursor over here, tends to be quite a bit in this area because those areas are closer to more intense topography. So there's more orographic lifting and a little higher lightning intensity. These are the lightning fires. We had 834 in 50 years. And even though many of these were put out and maybe many of these wouldn't have burned on their own, what we don't know is how many of those historically might have burned and what that might have looked like. We know that there was grass in the desert historically, but not like we're seeing these days. So this is a series of photos from Tonto National Monument. This is what it looked like the day before the Woodbury fire burned through the area. This is mostly red brome. And I want to point out too that there's a difference in the invasives or introduced. I'd rather call them introduced at this point. The introduced grasses in the northern Sonoran Desert are mostly annuals. The primary fire carrier is this one. This is red brome. It's an annual cool season. And what we see with that affects the fire severity is that because it's cool season, it tends to grow much more densely in the clumps of vegetation. So under the mesquite, under the palorude, under the hackberry, in those clumps of vegetation where you have saguaros. And so it provides the fine fuels, which can allow these areas or these clumps of vegetation to burn, where if they did not have that fine fuel under them, they wouldn't burn very often. The warm season grasses would have been more likely to grow between the clumps of vegetation. So when fire did burn, it's more likely it would have mostly burned between the clumps because it wouldn't have done as well in those clumps. So that's my latest theory anyway on the difference in the severity. We have these cool season grasses that come in and they provide contiguous fuel across the whole area. Here you can see where there's white ash, where it would have burned there would have been heavier fuels that burned completely. That unburned portion is that portion of the fuel that is not going to burn at wildland temperatures. And you can see there's plenty of area there where there wasn't a lot of deposition. So this is September after the Woodbury fire. And you can see we've lost some saguaro in this area and up on top of the hill, areas that the fire couldn't get to. So there will be refugia out there. We just don't really know what the pattern is going to look like. This is a year later, and once again, we have mostly red brome. There's a little bit of schismus in there, Mediterranean grass. It's another annual cool season that often fills the role of filling between the red brome out there so that fire can move from point A to point B. But a really important thing about fire effects is it's based on the amount of heat transferred, not the temperature of the fire itself. So these fires go really fast through these areas where they just don't put a lot of heat out. That means that the effects are going to depend a lot on what the fuel structure is in the area where they burn. So what I found really interesting was this one. We're now looking at September 2021. So this is 2 years, a little over 2 years after the fire, and there's not a lot of non-natives in here, and there's a fair amount of diversity. There are fewer saguaro, and some of them that are here probably aren't going to make it. But that leads to the question of, here's the final. This was just last year that we took, and it really doesn't look that awful. A lot of these grasses are native. And as we saw in monsoon of 2021, 2021, those grasses can come in quickly, the native warm season grasses. And in my mind, where there are grasses, most systems that are based on grasses are going to burn once in a while, with the possible exception of high elevation, alpine, and high latitude at Arctic. So the questions we're struggling with that we really need to understand in order to come up with appropriate management strategies are these, what was the role of fire in the desert before we kind of messed stuff up? And what is the role of fire now? And I would add to that, what will the role of fire be in the future and what's realistic? And I got lots of questions and really looking for feedback from anybody and everybody. So that's what I have for you all today. I am done.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. So everyone who has questions for Mary can hold them until the very end. Go ahead and type those questions in the chat. And with that, we'll go ahead and move over to Seth.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Mary, for giving an excellent introduction to the topic of today. So I do want to remind people that when we talk about invasive grasses in the Southwest, Mary kind of touched on this, but we're primarily talking about winter annuals where we have cool season precipitation, and then into summer perennials where we get more monsoonal moisture. And all of these particular species are problematic, and you recognize a lot of the players here. And in my own work, I do a lot of research to kind of understand how we can do a better job looking at early detection, monitoring spread, and evaluating treatment effectiveness. And then kind of looking at late in the invasion stage, thinking about wildfire risk assessments and post-fire restoration. So the dotted line here is just kind of showing.
You're not sharing your screen yet.
Oh, I apologize.
I thought you were just giving a really excellent introduction.
Okay, let me share my screen because that's important for you to see.
Looks perfect. Oh, now it's down again.
All right, here we go. All right, so here what I'm showing you, can you see, Rachel?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, so here what I'm showing you is phases of invasion where we have kind of low abundance and then this exponential increase that we know happens in ecosystems. So again, thinking about different ways that we can slow this invasive grass fire cycle by coming up with earlier forms of detection, monitoring spread, and evaluating treatment effectiveness, and then thinking about wildfire risk assessments and post-fire restoration. So I'll go through some brief examples of these different research activities with you today. So the first is kind of this early detection and monitoring spread. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal to help with this. One of the most powerful ones is remote sensing, because we can look at broad areas in space and look over long periods of time. And so the thing about a lot of our invasives in the Southwest is they, at least the winter annuals tend to green up earlier than the native vegetation. So here what you're seeing on this axis is just an index of greenness. And then we're looking across time. So here cheatgrass greens up fairly early compared to some of the surrounding native vegetation. And so we can take advantage of this unique phenological signature to track the grass in space and time. And so we've done this with different parks on the Colorado Plateau. So you can see the warmer colors here are indicating kind of hot spots of invasion of cheatgrass, where it continually shows up in our time series. And then on the right here is a recent assessment we did for the Mojave Desert, looking at a whole host of invasive annuals that are causing increased wildfire risk. And again, these warmer colors are kind of showing hotspots of invasion where they keep coming into the picture year after year. And so this kind of form of early detection, or if we're looking through time of spread, is really helpful for kind of prioritizing management strategies to control the spread. What's really important is, a lot of the remote sensing imagery that we have tends to be fairly coarse and not as helpful from a management perspective. So you can see on the right here is detection of cheatgrass actually in Yellowstone National Park. It's made it that far north. And it's pretty pixelated, right? But if we're using Planet Lab imagery, which can drill down to a lot finer resolution, this is the kind of information that's most helpful if you're trying to identify areas to treat, perhaps along a road or otherwise. So we're really trying to kind of get higher resolution information that can be more helpful for management. So in addition to using unique phenological signatures, we can also use spectral data where each of the invasive plants kind of has this unique spectral signature. And then this is to detect bufflegrass in Saguaro National Park. So Caitlin Elkind was able to use drone imagery and identify bufflegrass using its unique spectral signature in Saguaro National Park. And I think Helen will talk more about bufflegrass in the next talk. The other thing that we're really helping to understand is what controls spread. So here there's a host of different environmental and anthropogenic factors that could be influencing its spread. So for a particular area, we can weight whether it's the aspect or elevation is more important, or if things like distance to road and management practices are playing a role. And then on the right here, we can actually, quantify differences. For example, here, this is different aspects within both districts of Saguaro National Park, where we're finding bufflegrass, and you can see it's much more common on those south-facing aspects. Another tool we're kind of helping to develop is to actually look at how the invasive grass and fire interact. So what you're seeing here is a depiction of fuel load created by Lehman's lovegrass in southern Arizona. So the top picture is the pre-fire conditions. All those darker spots are high fuel loads. Then we have on the right a prescribed fire, and on the left a wildfire. And we can see that immediate reduction in fuel caused by the fire. But then importantly, we can look, 1, 2, 3 years later and look at the accrual of fuel and where treatments might need to be reapplied. Not necessarily advocating for prescribed fire in this case, but just suggesting that it's one tool that managers are using for some of the invasives in the Southwest. Okay, then one of the other activities we think a lot about is treatment effectiveness. And so this was a partnership with the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum and Saguaro National Park. I see Yaqing Ling is on the call. Yaqing developed kind of this map of all the different areas that Saguaro National Park has treated bufflegrass over the years. And because they've been doing it going back to the 1990s, we can evaluate how effective the different treatments have been. So over here on the right, you can see we have a depiction of how effective the treatments have been on this y-axis. So the higher the value, the more effective it's been at reducing bufflegrass. And we have both chemical and mechanical treatments that have been happening in the park. And so in the Rincon Mountain District, we can see that the chemical treatments have been quite effective, whereas the mechanical treatments have not been. They actually aren't significantly different than having no change. Whereas in the Tucson Mountain District, we can see that both chemical and mechanical treatments have been quite effective. Because there have been so many years of treatments within the park, we can also evaluate whether it helps to have multiple years of treatment. So here we can see 2, 3, 4, going up to 5 years, you're getting a bigger degree of effectiveness. Obviously, more resources are put into that, and that's a trade-off that's worth thinking about. We can also think about how many years of gap you leave between treatment years. And so if you have more years of gap in between treatments, you're going to start getting buffalo grass coming back into the picture. So I think these kinds of assessments are pretty important for thinking about, evaluating treatment effectiveness, and also if we're being cost effective. One more activity that I think is getting a lot more attention recently is to actually use fire simulations, which we're actively exploring for different invasive species. So the redder colors here are higher fuel loads created by the invasives. And you can see how the fire spread changes moving through this matrix. But importantly, we can simulate how different management practices might change the fuel load and thereby fire behavior through this simulation. Finally, I just wanted to end by talking about a program called the Restoration Assessment and Monitoring Program for the Southwest, or RAMPS. So importantly, we think a lot about post-fire restoration strategies and some of the best practices that can be put into use by managers, and helping with managers have access to information and tools that'll help them come up with helpful strategies after the fire has happened. And with that, I'll stop sharing and
Perfect. Thank you so much, Seth. I saw that there were a lot of questions, so again, we'll hold those until the end, and I'll pass it over to Helen.
All right. Thank you. Since we've been having trouble with the screen sharing, just checking to see, am I screen sharing okay?
Everything looks great. Thank you, Helen.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we went in this order. I think Seth's intro to buffalo grass gives me a good platform to go forth and talk more specifically about some experimental removals that we've been working on. And so I want to first acknowledge my co-authors on some of this work, Tiffany Sprague, Paul Staker, and Mary Fastigi. So I'll be talking about two specific studies, one on buffalo grass and one on fountain grass. As we know, buffalo grass and fountain grass can increase in density over time. It can fill in natural open spaces, as Mary was talking about with red brome. Same is true for buffalo grass, particularly in southern Arizona, but it is also in some areas in the northern Sonoran as well. It can increase fire risk and intensity, displace native plants, displace native animals in terms of their wildlife habitat. And it can also be very difficult to control. It can be very widespread. It can go in remote locations. It can be in high rocky areas that are hard to access. And buffalo grass in particular has regrowth from roots, and many have found that a multi-year effort is needed. And so what we wanted to do with our experiments is to determine cost-effective control measures for both grasses. And we also took a look at the native plant community response. And so we looked at effectiveness of removal, specifically the native community response, and then the cost. So our studies were both in the McDowell Sonoran Preserve in two different locations where those two invasives were most prevalent. And so for the buffalo grass, we had 8 treatments with 4 reps each. And for fountain grass, we had 6 treatments with 6 different reps each. And so here are the different treatments that we applied. So these were in, so we had uninfested control where there was none of the invasive grass, and infested control, which we did nothing to, and then pull, which is mechanical removal, and then mechanical removal with herbicide. Cut and herbicide cutting was with a weed whacker, and then herbicide a different number of times per year. And for fountain grass, we had just once a season. So this is a picture of pulling using these pickaxes to remove the plants physically. And then here, oh yeah, this is the spraying. And oh, here you can see a weed whacker. So that was just in the first year using that. And so we had 5 meter by 5 meter plots, and then we ran transects across them to with point intercept to measure plant and ground cover. And then we also did a survey of the plot after we'd run these transects to add in any species, native species, well, any species in the plots to add to species richness. And so I'm going to delve into our results. So in general, I'm going to have the fountain grass results on the left and the buffalo grass responses on the right. So for fountain grass, we started these efforts in 2018. And so these both show starting 1 year after, because that first year was baseline. And so this is the number of individuals per plot. And so you can see here that some of the treatments started off at 1 year after, had many more. So this is herbicide, pull, mechanical removal, and then cut and herbicide were higher than the herbicide twice a year. And uninfested control. But for over here for the buffalo grass, we had a lot in that first year still in different treatments, mostly in the cut and herbicide, manual removal, and the manual removal and herbicide. But there was a significant interaction effect where over time, everything except for the mechanical manual removal only remained high. So this definitely agrees with what Seth was finding in his study. All right, in his analysis. And so then looking at the native plant community, there's a lot to look at here. So these are all the different treatments. And basically what you see is the treatments were not different from each other. This is native plant total, native broken out, native perennial plants, native annual plants, and non-native plants. And really what you'll see is they're all grouped together. So there wasn't, although there was like a little dip here, there's basically what happened was the native plant community did not show treatment differences. There were only year differences. So over time, we had a dry year, a wet year, a wet year, and a dry year. So you can see that pattern play out in the native plant community, but essentially there weren't differences in impact on the native plant community, whether we use physical removal or herbicide. And so that was a good finding. And so some of our overall conclusions, oh wait, it's weird. I'm not seeing my cost. Anyway, well, so keep moving. So some of our conclusions is that the fountain grass responded well to all treatments. And so over time, by the end of the study, there weren't any treatment differences. So manual removal was just as good as herbicide removal. Again, there were no impacts on the native plant community, and herbicide and manual removal are both cost effective. However, for buffalo grass, difficult to control. Although we published our findings, we are still ongoing with that project because we still have small numbers of individuals coming up in the plots. We did find that repeated treatments were more effective in terms of cost and removal at larger scales. And overall, removal is expensive. And so in terms of next steps, as I said, we've published both of these studies, but we still are monitoring our buffalo grass plots because we're still curious to find out which treatment will finally, and if we can get rid of the buffalo grass in these plots. And so additional consideration is that sometimes we understand in the real world, there can be a combination of pulling and herbicide. For some reason, my slides on the cost effectiveness are not here. I might find them while others are speaking and bring them up in the Q&A so I can show them. But basically, at very small scales, pulling can still be cost effective, especially for fountain grass where it's actually effective. And then with herbicide, with buffalo grass, herbicide once a year can be effective in small scales. Cost effective, but as you get up in area, it's actually more cost effective to go with the multiple times per year because you can control it faster. Weather patterns can affect treatment efficacy. And then additional treatment considerations is that though trying to get water into the backcountry can be an issue. It's very heavy. The weed whacker didn't work in either study, and was expensive because you had to keep replacing the metal bits, and the string didn't work at all. And then the number of plants missed during treatment efforts is very difficult to get every single one, especially if you're in a management situation where you're doing large areas. Pulling increases ground disturbance and removal of cover, but again, for the plant community, there was no difference. Herbicide may leave more debris, standing debris, and that might lead to increased fire for those in the short term. And then the potential for negative effects, maybe on the applicators or animals. But overall, we think that better understanding these different treatment trade-offs can be useful for better control overall. I'd like to thank the McDowell-Sonoran Conservancy and the City of Scottsdale for their funding and participation in the study, and the botanists who helped us with all of our plant surveys.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. So we'll turn it over to our last presenter for the day, Alan Sinclair.
All right. Hey, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, perfect. I do not have a screen to share. I'm sorry, I was going to get some photos this morning and get them to you, Rachel, but didn't get that done. But I do want to, thank everybody for the opportunity to talk today. I retired after 31 years of federal service. I was an incident commander in the Southwest for six of my last years. When I retired, I was the incident commander for Southwest Area Team 1. And, those last few years, our team managed a lot of fires in the desert. I rookied on the Tonto National Forest in 1990 on the Mesa Ranger District. Spent 18 years running around the Sonoran Desert, putting out fires, and then became a fire management officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Phoenix area, and worked with tribes, in building their wildland programs and their fuels programs in the Phoenix area. In my career, I had to take a 401 course through NAU, and that's where I learned that I could be a better firefighter by understanding the outcomes of our actions and questioning the outcomes. Back in the day when I was coming up, it was all about putting the fire out as quickly as possible and moving on to the next one. And I know we did a lot of resource damage with our backfiring operations and areas where soil disturbance was created from line digging or actions like that maybe we didn't need to do. In retirement, I've now got a private fire crew and do fuels mitigation work for the state of Arizona and some cities, HOAs, and I do consulting and public speaking through T1D1 Consulting, and just really interested in making sure that the things that we're doing, we're understanding the outcomes. Some of the projects that we've been involved with have been creating fuel breaks in the Sonoran Desert. And I started questioning that. So one of the things that I'm interested in is doing the research and helping clients understand options. I have a 10-acre plot that I've been doing treatments to invasives and not doing any aggressive cutting, really trying to see over time what the cost is, how much effort it is, which years we have to take actions, which years we don't. Because currently the fuel break prescription requires a lot of cutting of endemic plants. In doing some research, I found a 2006 paper out of California, Miriam, Kelly, and Byers wrote about fuel breaks effects on non-native species abundance in California plant communities. And it kind of confirmed what I believe is that the disturbance of the aggressive cutting and removing of native vegetation enhances the invasive or introduced grasses and plants. So I think we need to understand that. I'm super excited to hear all the research that is being done. Research is so important to good decision making by land managers. Your fire personnel. They really need to understand what is happening with the actions that they're taking. And I hope that everybody on here has good communication with your agencies and with people responsible for fires in your organizations, because this should be something that interests them. How can we have the best end result for the areas that we are stewards for? And it requires some research. It requires collaboration. As an incident commander, I learned an awful lot from all the ologists that we were working with. And on a few fires, we employed a resource advisor liaison, somebody that had a really good relationship with our operational personnel and that could translate, what they were hearing from the local ecologists and people that were, working for the agencies that we were managing. And for. That became a very popular thing. It really helped us make better decisions. I remember a fire on Clark Peak. It had burned in 1996, the Clark Peak fire. Actually, it was outside of Safford, Mount Graham. 1996 Clark Peak fire, 2002 Nuttall fire. We had the Fry fire. And on both the previous fires, there were incidents where there was a shelter deployment on one and injuries on the other. And we really started questioning, why are we chasing fire across the top of Mount Graham? We presented the fire severity maps post 1996 and 2002 fires to the folks that were responsible for managing, like the Mount Graham red squirrel, the talus snails up there, some of the important plant communities up there. And what they saw, what from the previous burns was, what they would like to see. And so it became more of a walk in the fire across Mount Graham in a way to reduce negative impacts, but letting it just get back in and do what it was going to do. And we didn't put people in there. We addressed the fire as it came down into lower areas with road systems. There were areas, certainly special areas, that we needed to give extra attention to, but there was an ongoing conversation with everybody, and that's so important to communicate with everybody, make sure that this information's getting shared with the appropriate decision makers. So I'm not a scientist. I just a land manager, firefighter, IC background, but I am a complete fan of all the work that's being done to understand the changing conditions in the Sonoran Desert. I live in Apache Junction, Arizona. I spend a lot of time in the desert, and I see the changes. They're happening very quickly, as Mary pointed out. I've seen a lot of change in my career. I've noticed that we get these desert seasons about every 10 to 15 years. This most recent one was about the third desert fire season cycle I remember in my career. So I know that they kind of ebb and flow. There's peaks and then times where there's not a lot of fuel in the desert to burn. But that may be changing, because I know that we do have more introduced plants in the desert than we did when I started my career. So understanding their cycles, understanding when to take action, I think is appropriate. In designated fire breaks, I wrote a paper that suggests we should consider aggressively managing all invasives throughout a fire break instead of, cutting mature endemic plants. It's hard for me to direct my crew to cut something that's been growing there for a long time, when I know what the problem is the introduced grasses that are impacting that plant. But that's what the fire break prescriptions call for at this time, and I think it certainly deserves a conversation that helps people understand what the outcome is, what they're committed to once they cut, use of herbicide, or how they're going to maintain those fuel breaks once they open them up, let light in there. In some instances, it just creates a lawn of invasives throughout the project site. If anybody's interested in collaborating, I've seen what I got going on here in Apache Junction on the 10-acre, 4-hectare parcel. I'm certainly interested in sharing that, interested in collaborating. Part of what I want to do as now on the contracting side is support the science and the research that's being done for people to make good decisions, because I care about the desert. That's all I have for everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I'll turn it back over to Rachel.
Great, thank you so much. So we have some really wonderful questions in the chat. So feel free to keep popping those in there, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. If our presenters want to come on with their video, we can just kind of ping pong who answers. So starting out with this question from Matthew, wondering if a fuel break mentality should be maintained in areas that have moved past the tipping point for cost-effective control. So thinking of more of a landscape scale. Matthew has read some research to suggest that keeping fire out of areas may assist with restoration of the Sonoran Desert system.
Was that for any of us, Rachel?
It came in during your presentation, Alan.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually here right now. So hey, Alan, it's Matt Wilson.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm just curious on that because it's what seems to be happening here with some of these research is that it's done on a more of a finer scale, and I always am thinking about things on mid to landscape level. So it's difficult. Like I feel like I mean, obviously desert fires they end up being very large. Case in point, the Telegraph fire. So like I'm just trying to hear your opinion on like utilizing a fuel break with like annual or biannual maintenance and maintaining that as a permanent fixture to keep fire potentially out of an area, not just it being used as community protection, but being used as like a landscape level protection.
Yeah, no, great question. I think there's certainly an argument for point protection of, some of these fire refuge areas, saguaros. But again, what we're doing is so new. We really need to think it out. We really need to have conversations. We really need study areas. I've considered, when we first started doing fire breaks in the desert, along roads, like strategically burning piles, within the first, quarter of the project area closest to the road, and burning it hot enough to sterilize the soil so that you're not getting anything to grow there. But I don't know that that's the right thing. I'm really leaning towards, removing dead component and maintaining the fire break by aggressively managing all the invasives that are going to produce continuity of vegetation. I can't wait to talk to you. I heard you're kind of taking a deep dive into some of the stuff. I'm currently doing it too, but it's certainly something that should be considered. I think we've got kind of an open canvas right now, and we need to start understanding what's working, what's not working, what's creating future problems, and what the best approach is. Right now, I've got some gut feelings, but I can't say with certainty.
Yeah, likewise. I will follow up with you following. So,
Alan, did you want to follow up as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thought in these large landscapes, whether we can at least maintain invasive fuel breaks. And one of the things that some collaborators and I are working on is we've developed some biocrust sods that will be ready to deploy in November, and we'll be taking those. We've grown out biocrust on top of wheat fabric, and we're going to be taking that out to Tonto in the Telegraph fire burn area, and we'll be putting those out, and those will be something of a fire break. They have the wheat fabric underneath them, and then they'll have the biocrust component on top of them that will hopefully grow out. And so we've been out with Mary Lotta to look at those sites, and I have collaborators here at NAU about that.
Sort of stemming off of what you were just speaking about, Catherine was wondering if we know the impact of fire on biocrusts in areas with invasives versus native grasses.
I'm not sure that we do. It does depend a lot on how hot the fires are. And again, Mary Latta would be the first to distinguish between the sort of plant level fire severity and the soil severity. And so it could probably withstand some of the lower, but you know, if the fire's high severity soil, it's going to be burning in one place with a lot of fuels and probably would damage the organisms.
Okay, thank you, Helen. And then moving on to we have time for a couple more questions. We can probably stay on for a few minutes past the top of the hour if folks are interested. Hannah was wondering, Helen, if you could elaborate more on the cutting and weed whack methods used in your study. So what do you think is the best method for treating buffalo grass areas that have really dense canopy cover that might prevent effective herbicide application?
That might prevent?
That might prevent effective herbicide application.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so with our weed whacking, first of all, it was, you know, the string doesn't work because it breaks all the time, and so we use these blades, and those would break as well. So it's not, we didn't find any sort of weed whacker approach that would actually be helpful. We got the idea of weed whacking and spraying from some papers in Hawaii that are using it on fountain grass. And so there were a couple notes on that. And so that's why we included it as a treatment for fountain grass. And since we were doing the buffalo grass treatment, we figured we'd try that as well. But we really did not see any improvement with using the weed whacker. In terms of spraying, our spraying was always with handheld sprayers and just spraying specifically the plant green up. And so in areas where it's super dense, yeah, it just, I don't think that the weed whacker is really going to help, unfortunately. If I did have a minute, I found my slides. They were on hidden view. So I'd be happy to show them real quick if there is a minute, but I will let you decide on that.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, so let's go ahead and hold that until the very end. So trying to get to the last of these questions, one person was interested in the implications for management and control where outside of the Sonoran, where invasives like cheatgrass are moving into higher desert landscapes, like in north central New Mexico, and where you're seeing them concentrate under brush such as rubber rabbit brush and Apache plume in the arroyos and adjacent alluvial fans. What are some options that might be able to translate to these systems? And if you guys don't have the research base for that right now, you can just say, you know, we can dive into it later.
I'd like to say one thing on just invasives in general. We talk about them as invasives, and some of them have been here for well over 100 years and they aren't going anywhere. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't spend the time and effort if we can to try and keep and maintain some areas in as, I don't want to say pristine, but as resilient a condition as we can. Maybe that's not the right word either, but I think one of the things we need to be looking at is what are these invasives doing? What is the void that they were filling? I know in the Tonto, for example, there was an awful lot of grazing in the desert that disturbed the soil. That makes it easier for invasives to come in. And once they're in, they're there. Red brome was introduced in the early part of the 1900s, and it's pretty much everywhere on the Tonto. We can't cure that. We can try and protect some areas if there are areas of special botanical interest, for example, in regards to the fuels. The work that Alan's doing, I think, is really important for us to start to figure out how to protect values at risk, and therefore what all of you are talking about, because these introduced species are making it a very different system. One last comment then, that Ben Wilder's been doing some work on what he's calling grassification. I think many of us are familiar with that now. It's this positive feedback loop that we're seeing where the desert has burned, it's more likely to come back in grass, which makes it more flammable, and so on. So in terms of what do we do where we have the cool seasons coming in the desert under mesquite and palo verde and all that, or rabbit brush, I don't know that there's a lot that we can do there. I think we just have to be reasonable and very careful and thoughtful about where we put our effort with controlling non-native species. It can work in some areas, but we're not going to get rid of them. So we need to have that balance of where it's worth the effort and where we need to just understand what its role is now.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing in that perspective, Mary. In a lot of places, like you said, they're here to stay, and it's just a matter of picking the most pertinent or prioritizing spots that we treat. So we'll go ahead and do one more question and then wrap it up. Catherine had asked about what climate change vulnerability looks like in these systems for the top non-native species versus our desired native species, and how we might see things shifting with these extreme cycles and the stochasticity that we're seeing in our weather patterns.
Hey, I can take a stab at that one. I think that's a really good question. I think for a lot of these non-natives, the warming temperatures are kind of forcing them up the mountain and to further northern latitudes. You know, a perfect example of that is the cheatgrass that made its way up to Yellowstone, where I thought the temperatures were getting cold enough that it wouldn't occur there. You know, so that's kind of an example of a leading edge of, you know, cheatgrass getting beyond where we thought it would. But then, you know, you bring up a good point where there will be cases in which, you know, it may become too hot or too dry, or maybe the precipitation seasonality shifts in such a way that there will be areas that won't be favorable for the non-natives anymore. And so I think they're, you know, in a lot of ways, they're just like natives in that they're all unique in what their tolerances are. And there is some level of prediction to that. And there's some papers out that show that, yeah, you can predict that to some degree, but then in the case like, you know, cheatgrass moving so far north, that wasn't predictable. So yeah, great question, and something we need to do more work on for sure.
Thank you so much for taking a stab at that, Seth. So we are just a couple minutes past the top of the hour. I know that there are a lot of questions that we didn't get to, and I appreciate folks for taking a stab at answering those in the chat and for the engagement that we're seeing over there. I did put everyone's email address, all of the presenters, in the chat. I'll post that one more time. So I highly encourage anyone who, if you didn't have your question answered or you want to continue this conversation, please reach out to folks individually. Alan, Mary, Helen, and Seth, I would like to thank each of you so much for coming on today and giving these wonderful presentations. I know that it was a whirlwind and we could have a much longer discussion, but I look forward to keeping track of what you're doing in the future. So thank you.